Good evening. Welcome to This Week at Little Hills, Songs for Our Temple. I'm Melanie, and tonight I'm going to be talking to you about Psalms 55, 56, and 57. Starting with Psalm 55. The main theme for this one that sets it apart from the other Psalms is the feeling of being betrayed. This is a lament of David, and this is something that has happened to him shortly after he'd been betrayed by a friend. It starts off talking about times of trouble, like in verse 2 where it says, I am restless in my complaint, and I moan because of the noise of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. And something that stuck out to me about this one is that it's okay to be noisy about our grief. Sometimes in our pride, we like to try to not show it when we're hurting or when we're sad, but it's okay to do that. And David does that frequently in these Psalms. He shows us that it's okay to feel that and to express it. The next part of this Psalm is a desire to escape. In verses 4 through 6, David writes, My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. And I say, Oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Yes, I would wander far away. I would lodge in the wilderness. These verses make me think of all the times when God's people have a desire to not necessarily go through the horrible things that are ahead of them, like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he prays, let this cup pass from me. It wasn't wrong for him to pray that, and it wasn't wrong for him to want that, because ultimately he did submit to God's will, just as David here submits to God's will. And as Kidner writes, it is some comfort to us to know that there are spiritual giants who have had this urge, whether they've succumbed to it, like Elijah in 1 Kings 19 verse 3, or withstood it, like Jeremiah in Jeremiah 9:2 and 10:19. Some of God's people have taken the wings of a dove and flown away like Elijah did as he fled from Jezebel, and some of them not. But either way, the desire is natural and it's part of who we are. The next part of the psalm has a feeling of anger. The psalmist prays for God to destroy and divide the enemy because they're causing corruption. The psalmist David writes, divide their tongues. And this made me think of the Tower of Babel, where the forces of evil were divided, literally by their languages being divided. And this is what the psalmist is praying, that the forces of evil will be divided. The next part of the psalm is where it talks about the betrayal. For it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I could hide from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together. Within God's house, we walked in the throng. This reminds me of Jesus with Judas. Jesus knew from the beginning that Judas was going to be the one who betrayed him, yet he was still his friend. He washed his feet. He broke bread with him. David himself, later on, with Absalom, his son. Absalom betrays him. He's his very own son. And he tried to seize the kingdom from him and kill him. And David had to flee for his life. These kinds of situations where we're betrayed by a friend, these can leave us feeling conflicted. David still loved his son. He mourned for him. In 2 Samuel 18:33, he says, O my son Absalom, would that I had died instead of you. O Absalom, my son. So sometimes when someone hurts us, it's hard. It's hard to leave the situation. It's hard to do what needs to be done, but our love for them doesn't stop necessarily when they hurt us, and it makes us so conflicted, even when we're feeling anger at them. And even when those things happen, we also have anger. And in this psalm, the person who'd done those things, David writes that they deserve death. They have done evil and horrible things. When those closest to us betray us and hurt us, that makes it doubly hard. It hurts to be angry at someone you love, even if they deserve it. The irony is that as our friends may betray us, we might also betray our friends, knowingly or unknowingly. David himself, writing this psalm about being betrayed, later on he betrays Uriah, his friend, with Bathsheba. Our anger as humans can never be entirely righteous. In the conclusion of the psalm, David writes about his dependence on God. In verses 22 and 23, this is a very famous verse. I love this verse. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. But you, O God, will cast them down into the pit of destruction. Men of blood and treachery shall not live out half their days. But I will trust in you. We are to let God be the judge. Our job is to have faith and confidence in the one who will make all things right in the end, the one who sees every hurt. In Revelation 21:4, it talks about God making all things right and fixing all the hurts. It reads, He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning or crying nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And that's a beautiful thing to look forward to. Psalm 56 was written when the Philistines had captured David in Gath. And this happens, if you're looking for the context, this happens in 1 Samuel 21, verses 10 through 15. David was fleeing from Saul after Jonathan had given him that warning with the arrows, with the secret message. Then David had fled to the priest, where he and his men, that incident where they ate the holy bread, and then he fled to the Philistines. And David was afraid of the Philistines at this time. They'd recognized him. When he came into town, they knew exactly who he was, and they brought him to the king. And he pretended to be insane so that he wouldn't be captured and they wouldn't bother going after him. So this is the context in which this psalm happens. In Psalm 56, the first part of the psalm shows some fear. In verse 3, he says he's afraid. He says, when I'm afraid, I put my trust in you. Now, David was not a coward. He was exceedingly brave. When he was young, he fought a giant. He fought a lion and a bear. But he was still afraid sometimes. He was still human. Life is scary. But David knew what to do with his fear. He trusted God right through it. The fear did not keep him from action. The action of what needed to be done, and most importantly, the action of having faith in God. He had God's word, as it mentions in verse 4, and he knew that because of that God was trustworthy. And this trust in God is what helps him overcome his fear. In the next part of this psalm, it talks about how God knows our pain. In verse 8, it says, You have kept count of my tossings, put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Now, something that I learned in reading about this psalm, apparently in the ancient Middle East, there was a custom where people, when people died, you would gather tears into these little bottles. Like you would literally gather the tears into the bottles. And those little bottles were called lacrimatories. And they would put them into the tomb as a sign of respect and mourning for the person that they had lost. And I thought that was interesting that literally people would gather their tears. And so when David's talking about God is keeping count of our tears and he's gathering them in his bottle, that was something that people actually did. Now, we don't know in this particular psalm if that's what David is talking about necessarily, but nevertheless, our tears never fall unnoticed by God. As an example of this, many years later, when King Hezekiah had been told that he would soon die, God told him that he'd seen his tears. He said, I have heard your prayer. I have seen your tears. Behold, I will heal you. And that's in 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 5. And And there are references all throughout the Bible of God's book of remembrance. He sees everything, he knows everything, and he cares about everything. The hurt that happens to us, his children, in secret, the losses that nobody else knows about or cares about, they never go unnoticed by our Father who loves us. Our tears are all accounted for. The next part of this psalm, it talks about how God is for us. Even when pain happens, we can know that God is for us, as it says in verse 9. And it continues the thought in all the way forward in the book of Romans 8:31. It says, if God is for us, then who can be against us? It's a similar theme to this psalm. It says, what can man do to us? If God is for us, then that settles it. In verses 10 and 11, it says, in God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? And the last part of this psalm talks about how God delivers us, and it's for a reason. It's not just so we can sit and enjoy our lives. The reason is that so we can do God's will and walk in his presence, and that we can bring him glory. In verse 13, it says, for you've delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. Psalm 57. This is a psalm that is written when David fled from Saul in the cave. And you might remember that story from when Saul was pursuing after David, and he fled from him, and he had to hide literally in a cave. And the first part of this psalm talks about how our refuge is in God, which is kind of striking because he's probably literally inside of a cave as his physical refuge right then, but that's not what he's depending on. He's depending on God for his refuge. In verse 1, it starts off, in the shadow of your wings, I will take refuge. And it's quite appropriate for us to want that, to want to find refuge in God, not to always want to be guns blazing, going out on the offensive. It's appropriate for us to want to trust in God and sort of to hide in his wings. Besides that metaphor being used elsewhere in Psalms, it made me think of when Jesus said in Luke 13:34 and elsewhere, it talks about this. He's talking about Jerusalem, and he says, oh, how often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. Spurgeon writes, even as the parent bird completely shields her brood from evil, and meanwhile cherishes them with the warmth of her own heart, covering them with her wings, so do thou with me, most condescending God, for I am thine offspring, and thou hast a parent's love and perfection. And it's very appropriate that we're talking about this on Mother's Day, because God loves us more than the most loving parent possibly could, and his giving us the gift of parenthood and mothers of our own is to help show us just a little tiny glimpse of his love, even though we're imperfect. In verse 3, it talks about, too, that God sends out his steadfast love, his mercy, and his faithfulness. The next part of Psalm 57 talks about how the enemies are strong. Verse 4 reads, my soul is in the midst of lions. I lie down amid fiery beasts, the children of man whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Our enemy, does this sound familiar that the enemy is a lion? Because in 1 Peter, he talks about how our adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But we need to remember that the Lion of Judah is the most powerful, and that he will have victory over all. And the last part of the psalm is talking about praising God, even in the cave. And there's great power in praising God when we're in difficult circumstances, like David was and like so many others were. David praised him in a cave. Paul and Silas praised him in prison, where the walls shook and the chains were broken. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego praised him in the fiery furnace, and Jesus did not forsake them. We're to bring a sacrifice of praise, even when it's hard. In Hebrews 13:15, we're to bring the fruit of lips that continually praise his name. So this psalm wraps up with, "Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. My heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing and make melody. Awake, my glory, awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn." And as David was eventually delivered from Saul and walked out of his cave, so Jesus was the victor over death and walked out of the grave, paying the price for our sin so that we could have new life in him. Thank you for joining me. I wanted to remind you that Little Hills Church is meeting in person on Sunday evenings, every Sunday evening at 5:30, and we'd love to see you there. We'd love for you to join us. Also, please join us online for Monday night. Pastor Tim is continuing the Steadfast series, and we're on a series this week. We're continuing the series about bad attitudes. It's kind of a counterpoint to the series that we're doing on Sunday nights. And that will be at 7 o'clock p.m. So thank you for joining us, and have a blessed week.